Well, good morning here in London and good late afternoon out in Singapore. Welcome to FS Club. My name is Michael Mainelli, and we're here today with two special guests, Dr. Tony Tan coming in from Singapore and Corey Cook coming in from London here on a bright London morning. And one of the things that's going to be exciting today is your participation. This is a about ethics and is it calculated or not? And you're going to have to calculate a few times during the course of today's webinar. Now, as chairman, I am really delighted to be able to host such a wide-ranging series of webinars, and it wouldn't be possible without our sponsors. One of the great things about the FS Club is the not just the generosity, but I might add the tolerance of our sponsors who range across the fields of technology and finance, often where a social purpose meets. And this is, of course, very much a social purpose. How does a woman act correctly in today's environment? There's an old philosophy joke about, the fellow who succeeds in passing his ethics test despite being a terrible student. And his friend says, "How did you do it?" He says, "I cheated." And today, I think we're going to be examining what does it really mean to cheat, and understanding that there are many nuances to this subject. My job, as ever, is to get out of your way so that our two experts, Tony and Corey, can lead us through things today. After this, we're going to have two case studies, which are going to require you to poll. So, and then we'll be having a poll at the end. So be ready with fingers on buzzers. There will be 5 polls during the course of this 45-minute webinar. And further, we've reserved quite a bit of time for questions, hopefully about 15 minutes. So I'd encourage you to use the GoToWebinar question facility to ask questions of our two experts. So without any further ado, Tony, I'd like to hand over to you, please.
Thank you, Michael. So today we're going to do 2 case studies, but before we start on the 2 case studies, I just want to say 3 things. First of all, we are from CFA Institute, and I think an important part to raise is that our mission is to lead the investment profession globally by promoting the highest standards of ethics education and professional excellence for the ultimate benefit of society. So this is one of the reasons why we are doing such things around the world with a diverse audience base. Secondly, you will see 2 case studies following in today's session, and really we feel that cases are a good way to learn about what ethical behavior is all about and also what it isn't all about. So cases provide that lens in which you can actually look at yourself or look at other people and determine, is this the right way to behave or is this a right way not to behave? So something like an ethics case study brings about this very clearly. The third one is I do want to emphasize that the cases that you're seeing and the answers that we give to the cases are all coming from an individual's perspective. So we have written the cases to teach and to educate our members about what ethics is all about. And we have used our own code of ethics and standards of professional conduct handbook to determine what the right outcomes are for the different cases that you see. So keep that in mind as you go through the cases. Look at it from the lens of an individual, not from the lens of a corporation. So those are the 3 things really I want to say to start today's session. And to get things rolling, I'm passing it over to Corey.
Thank you, Tony. Morgan, can we have the first video?
The trade. Stan is a high-ranking government official who, because of her work with the intelligence agencies, is regularly briefed on potential threats to the country, both from a military and economic perspective. During a recent briefing, she receives information from the intelligence community about the strong likelihood of the onset of a global pandemic in the next 3 months. She recognizes that the pandemic will result in widespread economic shock and have a devastating negative effect on global capital markets. Dan contacts her investment advisor, Wang, and directs him to liquidate her investments. What should Wang do?
Okay, thanks, Morgan. This is just a slide of the summary of what the case was presented. Unfortunately, the video got cut off, but the last question should have said is, what should Wong do? But I'll just read the key facts so everyone can get the basis of the case. So client is a high-ranking intelligence official who has access to classified and confidential information that indicates a global pandemic is likely to start. This information is not in the public domain. The pandemic will likely lead to widespread economic turmoil. Tan contacts his advisor Wong to liquidate investments. What should Wong do? Next slide. So in the next moment, a poll will come up, but there are 4 choices: not execute the trades because they're a product of material non-public information, sell the investments as directed by the client, refuse to execute the trades because Tan's request is not in line with their previously established investment objectives, mandates, and constraints, or execute the trades but disclose any possible illegal activity to appropriate authorities. Okay, so we've got the answers from the polls, and one thing I'd like to point out that these cases, there's never a clear right or wrong answer in this case. So we like to see a dispersion of the answers. Morgan, next slide, please. So to recap the answers, we had a previous slide, please, Morgan. So just to remind everyone of the answers: A was not execute, B was sell, C refuse to execute, and D execute the trades but disclose any possible illegal activities. Next slide, please, Morgan. So based on the CFA Code of Standards and reviewing the facts of the case, the key issue here is it's material non-public information. And referring to the CFA standard, material non-public information, the information that was not disclosed was not in the public domain. But the key issue here is that the advisor or the investment advisor would have not known that and didn't have any reason to believe that those facts were in the public domain. So was the test material? Yes. Was it non-public? Yes. Was Tan in violation? Yes. But the key thing that I'd like to emphasize here is that is Wong, the advisor, aware of the material non-public information? Not likely. If he was aware, Wong can disclose the illegal activity based on the CFA standard, preservation of confidentiality. And there's also the issue about suitability. So in this case, choice B is the best option. One thing I'd like to say here is that these cases are all general in nature and they appeal to a wide global audience. So what I would like to emphasize is that if there is a circumstance where an individual or local regulation is the obligation to disclose, people would always follow the local law, which is a higher standard. So in the case of in the UK, for example, if you did have reason to believe that there was some illegal activity, there is a duty to disclose internally to your firm's compliance officer, and then they will make the decision to report that on. Next slide, please. Michael, do we want to
Yes,
have any
indeed.
questions? Or
Quite a few, actually. First one's come in from Bob McDowell. He emphasizes the investment advisor's duty is to his client and says the information is not confidential and is at best speculative at that time. What do you think about that?
I think with any of these cases, it depends on the individual circumstances of the facts. I think in this case, it's what the advisor would be likely aware of. So there was no reason for the advisor to have any information that this information was confidential. So as anything, these cases are just giving a framework for people to evaluate, to decide what's the best course of action.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add that the situation with the pandemic is actually very new. I mean, nobody in my lifetime has experienced something like this. And although the government official feels that it's going to impact the market, we really don't know. It has eventually, but we actually, at that point in time when we're looking at it, we really don't know because there is no precedence, there's no historical basis that something like this would impact the market as severely as it did. So maybe that's another point to sort of take note.
Tony, it's no relation to you, I hope.
No, it was written for a Chinese audience. We did this case in China with the China Capital Market Institute, so I changed the names to reflect the Chinese surnames.
I think what I liked about this one is how topical it was, and of course there were extremely different speeds of response. What was it? Singapore reacted at the very end of December and had testing from 1 January at airports. So you saw a differential element there on the information. So is the question here, though, knowing that there's a pandemic response in general, or is it having that kind of advanced knowledge of that specific country's reaction?
Yeah, so I think another point to take note of is when the information about the pandemic actually came about in China and Singapore, it didn't really affect the stock market very much, frankly. And I think a lot of people were referencing that to what happened with us during SARS time, 2003, 2004, when we had SARS. And I think we recovered quite well. So our reference point was based on SARS. So I would have thought I didn't really expect the market to react as severely as it has in the last couple of months. So,
well, this is Deborah Webster is pointing out, yeah, but now that we do know the impact, does that change the view or ruling? So are we looking here at some type of consequential ethics? It doesn't really matter what Tom was doing; it just matters what the outcome was, and potentially a very good outcome, at least in the near term, for his client, despite the rebound in markets a few months later.
I think it's always the benefit of hindsight, and there have been some recent examples in the U.S. A very similar aspect to this case, where some senators were trading in advance of this that had access to the pandemic information. I think the issue that comes up here is the duty to disclose, and it's often a difficult choice for people trying to preserve confidentiality. But what is the reason, the suspicion that there is an obligation to report? And I think it's important to know that it shouldn't be, everything in terms of your duty to report is a hunch, but there should be some material fact or piece of evidence or some thing that you can pass on to the person that you're reporting to that would leave you reason of suspicion to report. But that also gives you some comfort that if you did report, it was based on facts and not solely just a hunch or an intuition.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because there's a film that was doing the rounds. It was made, I think, about 9 years ago, called Contagion. And in that film, one of the senior advisors at the Center for Disease Control acts on information that only he has to try and have a family member escape from a lockdown area just before the lockdown takes effect. So it's not necessarily just a financial implication, is it?
No, absolutely not.
Just to hear one other question. You've got TAN in violation, but is TAN an institute member?
No, these are just fictional characters. So this is not a real case, but we wrote the cases to reflect what happened during the pandemic in the last couple of months. So the next case is also related to a pandemic, but there's nothing to do with any of our members.
No, I meant it in a slightly different way. In your case study, is Tan a member of the institute, or is just Wong?
Both of them are. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, so probably Wong is a member of the institute.
Yeah. So how is Tan in violation of an institute she's not a member of?
Well, if he or she were a candidate, he would be a violation. But we just wanted to emphasize the point that using material non-public information would be a violation of our code and standards, whether he was or he isn't a member. And I think the same for Wong also, whether he is or isn't. If both of them are members, Wong would not be in violation, Tan would be in violation.
Okay. And kind of a last question, something that's always bothered me personally as well, but this is about, because this is very close to insider trading and things, material information that's non-public. Markets work on information. So how is it that this type of release of information, and sentiment is information. I'd like to sell my shares because I can see what's coming. Why is that an ethical violation?
I think in terms of there are two parts. It's, in terms of how we deal with this, it's after the fact and before the fact. And the thing that we haven't talked about is before the fact. So the one thing that TAN could have done is that there's a duty for people who are in positions of trust or have access to material non-public information, is to remove the potential conflict of interest to start with. So the one thing we haven't talked about is what could have TAN done to prevent this from happening, and the first thing would be is to probably put all of their investments in a blind trust where they could not be accused of acting in their own personal gain. So, and that's the thing that I don't think gets talked about enough is for people to just remove the ethical dilemma or conflict to begin with.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would add another dimension to it. When you look at cases related to non-public information or material non-public information, it generally relates to the integrity of the capital markets. And I like to use the example of, would you want to be going to play a game where you're wagering something, and know that you're going to be cheated all the time? So what we're trying to do here is to ensure that people who are in the capital markets have a fair chance of uh, earning their returns if they make the right decisions, and not be affected by other people having better information than them that they should not be using to their advantage. So it's also slanting towards the direction of improving the integrity of the capital markets.
I think that's a really, really important point, because there's been an interesting stream of ethical consideration about a manager's obligations to capitalism. I wish it was said more like managers' obligations to free markets, but this idea that the market itself is almost a common entity to which you have an obligation to support, which is kind of the point there, to make sure that the market is seen to be a good market. Matthew Leach is a really intriguing question. Okay, how many people have to know something for it to be considered public? Or is it just necessary for the information to be available if anyone were to ask, even if nobody has asked?
A good question, and I'm not sure I have the answer. I think in order for it's what a reasonable person would do, and what the effect of that information would have in the marketplace. So, and then you're getting into the granularity of different exchanges in different jurisdictions. But I think generally, when I'm looking at this or trying to answer a question, is because the difficulty is that if it's truly confidential or it's non-public, then you would really only know what the facts are. So it has to come down to the test of what a reasonable person would do and what a reasonable person would conclude on what the effect of the information would have. But that is a very good question.
Does your interpretation, though, mean I have to gauge the average intelligence of people?
No, but it comes back to what a reasonable person would think. So, and that's, I guess, if I use another example, if you're in a jury trial and you're being judged and you're a jury of 12 of your peers or 11, what would be, the widely held belief?
Okay. Well, we've got to move on to the next one, but before we do so, we're going to have a poll. But I'd like to ask both you, Tony, and Corey. 42% of the audience said that they would take option D, to execute but disclose, and you said that option B, to sell, was the correct one. Can you each maybe give one pithy thing they should think about before they revote that might help them change their mind to yours?
I think the difficulty with this question, and I'm not surprised at the answer, is that you're getting into the granularity of what local regulations are for, and it depends on which part of the world are. But I think in terms of going back to the original point, was there anything that Wong had that would lead him to believe that TAN was up to no good? And from the facts of the case, which were difficult in the context of a very limited example that we've given. There wasn't an apparent fact that there had been something wrong. But had there been a fact that Wong would have had something to believe that Tan had something and was trading unethically, then you would see people falling into the more of D as the best option.
Great. Tony, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we've got a wide range of answers suggests to me that this is actually a very good question, because the cases are never designed to get one complete answer. And really, the point that Corey made was absolutely true. Did he know that he was dealing with material non-public information? And if we assume that you don't know that he was dealing with non-public information, then you take B. But if you assume that he is, then you would choose D. So again, the assumptions are very important for a case like this. But great question.
Yeah, I agree with you both. I really think it is a good question, and the very fact it forces this range is there. But Morgan, while we're gassing, do you mind putting up the second portion of that poll? So, folks, this is your opportunity to change your mind, but by persuasion rather than force. So please do select one of the answers: A, not execute; B, sell; C, refuse to execute; or D, execute but disclose. And a reminder that execute but disclose was what you majored on the first time, and in fact sell was the least likely. Getting up to just half of the audience voting, so do get your votes in quickly. Okay, Morgan, I think that probably is enough time. Great. Wow. Corey and Tony, what a change. We have the noyau dur, the hard nut of people who refuse to change their mind. So 42% went up to 44%, but everything else switched to sell. And so we have it running neck and neck between B and D, which I think probably, as you indicated earlier, is also an expression. How can he disclose if he doesn't know? So the assumption that he knows or he doesn't know is really the crucial one there. Shan Turnbull adds, might these ethical dilemmas be resolved by any public exchange requiring also full disclosure of the identity and any special information they may possess? So also very interesting. Anyway, Morgan, if you want to switch us back to the slides. And
one last point that I'll make,
sure.
Michael, that and this has come up in some of the previous presentations that I've done. When people have a dilemma or having difficulty rationalizing a decision, I always find the example that if this were to come up in the future, how would I have been judged about the actions that I did? And the example that I'll use is that if this was on the front page of the FT and I was mentioned in the FT, is what I've done reasonable? And usually people can come to a quick conclusion, perhaps sometimes being overly cautious, which is a risk, but that's always an example or a process that I would do if you're struggling. And also, we hadn't talked about this as well, is that it's important to have people that you trust, not revealing confidential information, but there are situations where it's good to get a second pair of eyes to help you rationalize your decision.
Yeah. And Matthew Leach has added here, that it's this bit about secret information, and he suspects that if you ask what should he have done instead of what should he do now, people might realize we're using information now available due to hindsight. So might get a different pattern of answers initially. Good point, Matthew. Thank you. Anyway, in the time available, Morgan, do you mind moving along? And Tony, I believe you're going to lead us through this one. Is that correct?
Yep. Let's see whether we can get the video to play.
The client's assets. During a severe economic downturn brought on by a global pandemic, major stock indexes and the equities of previously safe blue chip companies are losing 3% to 4% of their value on a daily basis. Who is a discretionary investment advisor for several retired clients in the same social circle. During the market collapse, several of Ku's clients are on an ego tour vacation on a cruise ship to South America and Antarctica. Almost 60% of the passengers on the ship have contracted the virus, and the trip has been aborted. But because of fears of contamination, the cruise ship has been denied entry to many ports and is currently headed to Japan. But it will take several weeks for the ship to arrive, and regular communication with passengers is severely disrupted. Although the accounts are discretionary, Ku's practice is to meet with clients in person at least twice a year, and whenever their financial picture changes or major swings in the market signal a need to review their investment policy statements. But now, the fast-moving nature of the markets and the client's isolation make it impossible to meet with them to discuss how to manage their portfolios. What should Ku do?
Yeah, sorry about that. We seem to have had the same problem. Do you mind completing that, Tony?
Yeah, no problem. Can you go to the next slide? The one after this? The one after this, let me just summarize it. Yeah, so the key facts are we had the COVID-19 outbreak, and Ku, as the advisor, is unable to contact his clients who are on a quarantine cruise ship. And you can recall that this actually really happened in terms of a quarantine cruise ship, and particularly in my part of the world. Although the account is discretionary, Ku practice was to meet the clients twice a year in person to discuss market swings and update investment policy statements. At that point in time, probably mid-March, the client's portfolio were losing 3 to 4% a day. Ku, as the advisor, cannot contact the clients. He doesn't know what to do. So should he trade and do something because it is under a discretionary account, or should he wait until he can talk to his clients? So what would you do? Can we show the next slide, please, Morgan? So there are 4 options here. 1, A, you can make no changes to the client's portfolio until you can talk to them. B, you can try to protect the client's assets by moving their investments to cash. C, you can contact close family members of the client to get insights on what is the right course of action to take. Or D, you can seek permission from your employer to freeze the accounts until you can consult with the clients in person in compliance with the firm's usual practice. So those are the 4 choices. And what I like to do, if you can, Michael, is for the participants to not only make a polling vote on the questions, but to also write in their chat box why they've chosen a certain course of action. And then let's have a discussion around the situation as to why they chose a particular course of action.
Yeah, just a question here from the audience, Tony, from Elaine is just asking, would you mind explaining what it means to freeze accounts?
Oh, so basically, the firm will say you can't touch the account under any circumstances, which means to say your discretionary privileges are revoked.
Okay. So folks, while you're voting, just a reminder that in addition, Tony and Corey would like you to just type into the question box your comment on why you made a particular selection. Okay, Morgan, I think we can call it there. We've got a few comments here. Tim saying freeze by contacting the section head. There might be a company policy on this. Elizabeth says all clients should be treated the same. Bob says it's very simple. The primary duty is to the client. The other matters are peripheral at best. Alex says we don't have discretion to make investment decisions, therefore we can't change. Deborah says it is a discretionary account, so in principle you have permission to trade without consultation. Shan says I would want any advisor with discretion to use his knowledge to make decisions for me because he already knows my goals and needs. Jane from West London says discretionary means the advisor should decide in these circumstances. Matthew is doubtful and wondering if policy statements tell Ku what to do in a situation like this. Elderly tend to be long-term investments, says Robert. Christiana, close family, provided that it is okay given mandate, otherwise protect. And Graham says discretionary means what it says. Probably wrong switch to cash, however, but that is an investment point. I myself was wondering, and a few other questions coming up. But I hope that gives you both the tenor of what people are thinking, and everybody roundly went for B, protect client assets. So back to you then, Tony.
Okay, so it's very interesting to see the results. Let's go through what's the answer that we had when we actually looked at this case. So the key issue here is really at the end of the day dealing with your client's interests. And the CFA standard that we use is the one on loyalty, prudence, and care, which essentially means putting your client's interests first. So the first question we ask is there a investment policy statement or any client agreement signed between the investment advisor and his client? And we actually don't know the answer. I'm not sure how it works in the UK, but in Singapore and in my part of the world, the IPS and clients agreements are generally not very common. Then we go to the situation where is this extraordinary? And it probably is extraordinary. And because it is extraordinary, we then ask the question, is cash appropriate? We think it is inappropriate. Should he have disclosed it to the close relative? We actually think it is not appropriate because there are confidentiality issues. And is freezing a good idea? And because the accounts is discretionary, actually freezing would cause you to have more problems if you think sometime down the road, or if you manage to contact the client that you need to do something, it might actually put some rigidity into the whole process. So from this, we use a concept called the ethical decision making model, which we'll show you later on. And we felt that choice A, which is to make no major changes to the client's portfolio until they can be consulted, is the best option. So that's where we came up with. Would love to hear your comments and views as to whether you feel we've convinced you that this is a better answer. So over to you, Michael.
Yes, indeed. Well, Tony, the board is lit up with something like 40 questions. So it's going to be a little difficult for me to summarize, but I think I discern two lines of argument, which are, in my opinion, personally, I find them quite strong. The first line is very much concerned with what you meant by discretionary. The second line is concerned with the appropriate investment advice. But let's just start with the first one on discretionary. My understanding is, a discretionary account is I can kind of do what I want. Your argument here is that my mandate doesn't allow me to go wholly to cash. That sounds like a strange discretionary one to me, or would you think that's a common approach?
No. The discretion is you can do what you want, but we are saying that moving into cash, although you're allowed to do it, it's not a good idea at this point in time. So you can move to cash.
Why is it not a good idea?
Because you don't have the ability to talk to the clients and understand the situation a little bit better.
Okay.
And this is a major sort of a market moving event. Sorry, I've got some aeroplanes flying over my house now.
It's okay. There's another point here. How is this different than the client being in a coma during a major market movement?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
How is this different than the client being in a coma or otherwise incapacitated during a major market movement?
Well, that's a very good question, because in one of my sessions, we had the same point coming through, saying that because they are elderly people, they may have been one of the people infected by COVID-19 and were for some reason unable to communicate at all. If that is the case, then isn't it better for the estate to take over the decision of the client rather than me trying to meet the needs of the clients who I don't really know what the future is going to be like?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if a view is that the client is incapacitated for some reason, I think it's always better to don't do anything.
There are several people here, and I'm trying to amalgamate a large number of questions, interested in the role of the family members. In other words, what does this achieve? Is sort of what they're saying. I mean, either you are acting on behalf of the client who you can get hold of or you're not. Did the mandate say, in the event of me being incapacitated, I go and talk to my close family? But if it didn't, what's that got to do with anything?
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but to me the issue is that as long as there is no knowledge of the status of the client, we have to assume that he's alive. And if he or she is alive, then we have to acknowledge that there is confidentiality unless express permission was given by the client to communicate to close family members in case they can't be contacted. We always take the view that the information is confidential. So unless there's assumption that the investment policy statement or client agreement allows you to communicate, you can't communicate.
And Michael, the one thing that I also, and I'm not surprised by the answers in terms of the distribution, but the one thing that is important, and when I talk to people who are managing client investments, the biggest risk in terms of the circumstances is that a vaccine is found and the market gaps 20 or 30% higher. So when people are reading cases like this, the natural inclination is to think about the markets going down, but to the example that you put the client all in cash, and then the market goes up 30% the next day, and the client calls you and say, well, hold on a second, we've been meeting every time before we've done this, and you've done it out of context. Why did you do that? So it's not an easy decision, but I think it's great that we're getting a variety of viewpoints, but that would be something that I would just have people think about as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also, sorry, just one more thing to add. I think it's also important. We have assumed here that there is no investment policy statement or client agreement. And one of the things we wanted to get across of this case is the importance of having some sort of information related to, if I'm not contactable for whatever reasons, what can you do?
Well, this is a good point, because Bob McDowell says if somebody's incapacitated, the advisor should have required a power of attorney to be given to somebody close to the elderly couple beforehand. So that would change.
Absolutely.
But I'd like to move on briefly to the investment attitude. So the implication to me was that the advisor thought that moving to cash was something probably useful to do. And I'd almost leave that to one side. What was the right decision? But for example, Elaine Ray says, I guess at the start, nobody knew what the outcome would be and how to manage investments. So holding investments is one possible valid decision. I did that myself, she points out. Well done, Elaine. You're doing well. But this bit is I think an interesting one, because Matthew Leach says the scenario mentioned an investment policy that is discussed periodically with the client. So what are you assuming that policy determines? What about determining the action to take in a general market fall with no contact possible with the client? So almost, is this a deficiency well before this event? I would find it interesting that I had an investment policy that didn't talk about what a major market fall might mean.
Yeah, and then also that the most important thing that we haven't, or one of the most important things we haven't talked about, is what the time horizon is of the portfolio. So if it's much different, if the time horizon is that this is a 2 to 3 year portfolio that has to meet for a payment in 2 years, that's one thing. If it's another thing that this is a long-term portfolio that's providing for the estate or the children, or 30-year plus horizon, then all of these types of market events are a blip over the long term. So again, difficult if you don't have these specific facts, and but these cases are just designed for people to think about. But I think time horizon would be a major factor that you need to know.
Yeah. So another thing that I think what the questions that I had in the past was related to what is the portfolio allocation in the first place. So if the portfolio allocation, because they were senior elderly people, you would assume bulk of it would be in bonds and cash. So if you had to say 10%, 15% allocation in equities, does it really make sense at that point in time to convert 100% to cash? So those are all the kind of questions that have come up and comments that have come up. But like Corey mentioned, the idea behind designing this kind of cases is to provoke discussions. It's to be as ambiguous as possible so that discussions can flow.
Well, it's interesting about the time horizons. Deborah Webster points out, fair enough to freeze them as long as the industries the clients invested in aren't airlines or hotels. So, so very good. Yeah, I must say, this is me just speaking personally. I find it interesting that just when I might need somebody to exercise their discretion, rather than chatting to me all the time and claiming it's discretionary, just when I need it because I can't do anything, you're telling me that their best course of action is to do nothing. Um, and I think I do wonder about it. The best course of action may be to do nothing in the circumstances. A decision not made is often far more important than a decision made, and they don't need to feel they have to act, but they should, in my opinion, think through what their discretionary acting is, other than saying kind of, you can't get hold of me, so I refuse to do anything. I don't need an advisor like that. So I personally, that's my personal view, but
and to the earlier point, Michael, that Tony made, we've never had a pandemic or a situation like this before, and I think it would be highly rare that people would go through that. If I'm on a cruise ship stuck because of a pandemic, this is what you should do. But I imagine there'll be a lot more conversations going on right now when new investment policy statements are being drafted.
Yeah, I think that the coma point was interesting because it takes it out of the pandemic a bit. Final question on this one, because we do have to move along, sadly. This is really quite fun. Are the ethics of this question materially different in different cultures, or is the main difference the way that such funds would be governed and regulated? That's from Ian in far western Wales.
Yeah, I think different parts of the world would actually treat this quite differently. I can see from your part of the world, the answer to protect the client's asset suggests that the advisors take their roles very seriously, and all they want to do is make sure that their clients are protected. But I think in the Eastern culture, making such a big decision without personal contact involved or the discussion involved would be very hard. So yeah, so I would say different cultures would act very much differently.
That's an excellent response, Tony. Really, I appreciate that. Wow. And it makes the point, doesn't it, that these types of questions are all about balance. There's a lovely thing in bioethics called principalism, which covers beneficence, non-maleficence, the ideas of autonomy, and also justice, where there is no right ethical, normative ethical answer. It's a balanced set of discussion, which we're having today. Thank you. Anyway, if I could, Morgan, do you want to tee up the fourth poll, please? So, folks, just to remind you, 69% of you suggested to protect the client assets, and our expert panelists believe that in most cases, the answer to choose would be A, make no major changes. This is your opportunity to influence the vote. Well, I must say, I'm just looking here at the charts, and one of the things about this session is virtually nobody's had left because they've got another meeting or a coffee cup to get. So you're really holding the audience. I think 2 people have left in the last 45 minutes, which is astonishing. Right, Morgan, I think that's plenty there. So astonishing change here, a bit like the last one. We seem to have this hard nut of people who are sticking to their first answer, which was number 2, to protect the client assets. But you've massively swayed the audience towards A, make no major changes, as you did the last time when you swayed the audience towards your recommended decision. And I think this is just absolutely fascinating what you succeeded in doing here. So well done, Corey and Tony. Morgan, do you want to flip back to the slides? And I think, Tony, you were just going to lead us through a couple of closing remarks before our final poll. Is that correct?
Yep. Can we show the next slide? Yeah, so I just wanted to say that when we were coming up with our answers for the cases that we posed to you, we actually followed our CFA Institute ethical decision-making framework. And basically, it just goes through asking this question. So identify what are the ethical principles, what duties do you have to others, what are the important facts that are missing or that you need to know, and how does conflict of interest come into play. And then consider things like the situational influences and what other alternative actions are available. And if you can't get that, should we get additional guidance in deciding what the right thing to do is? So once you know what the right thing to do, then act by making a decision. Or if you can't really do that, then elevating the issue to a higher authority. And then lastly, because this is a continuous learning process, it's not it's not a technical subject or science where it's a precise answer. We encourage all our participants to reflect on what have been learned, and think about your own strengths and weaknesses in dealing with such cases. So this is the framework that we use for our analysis of cases, and you can find this plus many, many more resources available on ethics at our website at cfainstitute.org/ethics. So that's something to share with you if you want to know more about how we come to make ethical decisions.
Michael, I'd also add that none of these things are very easy in terms of, and the questions are designed to sort of provoke discussion, as we said before. But going to my earlier point that if you're looking at the future and people are looking at you and how you are judged, it's a very defensible thing saying, look, it was a difficult decision. I took additional advice. These are the process that I've done, as opposed to saying, I internalized the decision on my own. I made the decision. It's much more defensible if you follow this framework, because that way you can say, these are the steps that I've done, which I think are very reasonable, and how people will be looking at the decision in the future. If you went and consulted a few trusted individuals, that's a very reasonable and highly strong process that you've done to come to the conclusion. The decision, the outcome might still be wrong, because it's difficult if you don't know all the individual facts. But just to remind people that these things aren't easy, and get advice if you need to.
Yeah, and the most common response I get from something like this, is that it takes your intuition and emotions out of the picture. Once you have something to follow, your intuition and emotions will say one thing at the beginning, but once you go through this process, it sort of takes away the intuition and emotion in the analysis. And intuition and emotions can come from so many sources. So something like this basically provides a factual response to a case.
Well, folks out there in the audience, Morgan's going to put up a final poll for you. Corey, Anthony, and I wanted to ask you this question. Has this webinar made you feel better able to address an ethical question you face? While you answer that, I might point out that one of the things I found interesting about this whole approach to ethics at the CFA, and frankly also other institutes, CISI, exhibit, is an interesting point, really, that the old Greek version, or Roman as well, of virtue ethics, the idea that by being a good person, you would therefore make good decisions, I think to some degree dominates thinking in this space. And what Tony and Corey emphasize in this framework is very much the idea that you need to externalize some of that. It doesn't mean virtue ethics isn't right. It just means that by going through this external process, you, one, hopefully make a better decision, but two, you're better able to evidence that rather than sort of saying, well, I'm a virtuous person, and therefore I make virtuous decisions. I have no particular accountability. And I think that is an extremely important point for those of us who are facing these sorts of decisions. So I see the poll here is overwhelming support for has it made you better able to address the next ethical question. For the 14% who answered no, please do feel free to email us here at FS Club and Xian and make some suggestions about how we could make such a session on ethics in future more able to help you. So Morgan, if you don't mind, I'd just like to move to a couple of closing remarks, if I might. One is just to thank our sponsors again. Wow, here we are sailing people with cruise ships seeking Japanese harbors, and we've got MI6 officers sneaking information for investment advice. What a wide range you've brought us, Tony and Corey. That was extremely good, and I really, really appreciate the preparation and thought that went into this. I would like to say to the audience, thank you. We have a number of events coming up. In fact, so some really fascinating ones tomorrow on insurance carriers, two on Thursday on focus on Busan, the ever fascinating Vinay Gupta. We're going to be talking about quantum resistant encryption on Friday. As ever, go to the website. But may it falls to me, and very sadly, Tony and Corey, you can't see the audience or hear their applause, but I think you can tell from the huge responses to the poll, the fact that everybody has stayed online and the large number of comments and questions. You really, really engaged us. So I'd like to say thank you so much for your contributions today. And I'm afraid all I can give you is a very far Eastern talk here to say thank you very much. And we hope to have you back, hopefully with some more questions like this. This is a really, really interesting and mentally fun session. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for taking.
Thank you, Michael.